balancing my tripod super precariously on a really tall stack of books. I am Julia, welcome to Book Time, and I am in a house we have just moved into, and because everyone is working from home, my husband is in the study with his two big monitors and computer and everything, so I am filming, oh, fluffy tail, filming in the hallway, which is the other best place for natural light. So I'm in the hallway. Hopefully I'll find somewhere with a better background to film next time, but I've been, as we all have, feeling very strange about these strange times and just wanted to film a video to cheer myself up because I haven't done one for ages. And I don't know if any of you guys get this feeling, but when you haven't done one for ages, it's like gets harder and harder to film again because you feel kind of out of the community, and I haven't been keeping up watching people. So anyway, I'm feeling good. Now I'm back. I'm just gonna do a wrap up today of mostly books I read during January and February, because during March I actually haven't read much. I've been in a real reading slump, and I think it's to do with being stressed. We've also been moving house, and it's very hard to, well, we've found it very hard to unpack properly with our kids at home, and so it's just taking a long time. I haven't been able to find my books and my tripod I just found then. So anyway, doing it now, even though January and February were quite a while ago. So the first book I read for this year was The Hoarder by Jess, which is out in Australia from Canongate, same publisher as the UK. I loved this so much. It was so much fun. I think I'd mostly heard about Jess through Simon, and but I know that when I mentioned this in a TBR at some point in the last few months, a lot of people commented and were like, it's really good. Camera just stopped again randomly. Okay, Jess, this was really good. So this is the story of Maud Drennan, who is a personal carer or occupational therapist, I guess, for elderly people, and she gets assigned to this guy called Cathal Flood, who lives in an old house, and he is a hoarder, very extreme hoarder. So the book starts off and she's cleaning out his kitchen, and her job is to help him clear out stuff, but also make sure he eats healthy meals and like lives in a reasonably hygienic environment, because obviously with hoarding, a big problem is it's not sanitary, and you find, you know, she finds dead cats and all sorts of things in there. Anyway, it kind of turns into a mystery because Maud, I don't want to give too much away. There's also a lot to explain. It turns into a bit of a mystery about Cathal's wife, who is, she's died in the past, but also his children and their identities. They're grown up now, but also he's hiding stuff in a wing of the house, and Maud accidentally gets in one time. And then at the same time, there's a backstory of Maud and her sort of childhood trauma and how that affects the way she reads situations in the present day. So a lot of the time you can't tell if she's picking up real clues about maybe dodgy things that have happened to members of Cathal's family, or whether she's just projecting like her own fears and anxieties onto this situation. Maud also has an agoraphobic neighbour called Renata, and Renata gets in on the mystery as well. So Maud spends a lot of time with Renata because Renata obviously can't go outside. Renata, because she's stuck at home all the time, watches a lot of crime TV and like true crime and crime mysteries, and reads a lot of crime novels, and so she starts trying to solve the mystery too. And there's all this stuff about hidden identity and memory, and you know, how reliable is your memory, and how does trauma affect the way you read things in the present. It's really funny, it's really heartbreaking. The characters are so richly drawn. Like I can remember their names and their personalities and what they look like so clearly. It's sort of like literary fiction, but with a really good plot as well. You know how it's sort of sometimes rare to get really great plot that you just want to find out what happens, but also exceptionally well written, very funny, and yeah, I recommend it. I've got one of her other books as well, Things in Jars, so I can't wait to read that either. The next one I read was A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos. In Australia, this is out through Text Publishing. It's translated from the French by Hildegarde Serle. Look, I had very high expectations for this because it was so hyped and I enjoyed it. Couldn't put it down. It was a real page turner, but I think overall it was probably a 3-star read for me. So essentially it's a fantasy. It's marketed as a YA fantasy, but it could just be a regular fantasy too. It's about a young woman called Ophelia, and she lives in a world where the Earth has been split up into fragments, and the fragments exist kind of in this plane in space, but you can travel between the fragments, and she's engaged to marry a man from another fragment. So she moves from her nice home fragment or they're called arcs, the different fragments, her lovely family, which is bustling and has a nice community and runs really well, to this freezing cold one, which initially I thought was going to be really cool because it's when she first gets there, it's all about this sledding and ice and forests. But then what it turns out to be is that they live in this sort of magical castle. So this is quite a good picture of the arc. It's sort of, the wintry land is underneath, and then on top is this, what's it called? The City Celeste. So I guess that's City in the Sky or City in the Stars or something. And it's kind of ends up just being about courtly intrigue and manipulations of all the rich people in society. And while it was page turning and I wanted to find out what happened and it was interesting, there were other elements of the world that weren't explored that I thought would have been more interesting. So everyone in the arc that Ophelia moves to has magical powers, and the powers of the rich were explored, but I was really interested in the ones of the underclass, because whenever Ophelia got out of the rich people's world, yeah, the underclass seems so much more interesting. And there are more books in the series. I have the next one, which I will get round to, but I guess I don't feel like necessarily like I need to get to it in a rush. But if you think I should, please let me know, because I know a lot of people have really loved the second one as well. So yeah, it was good. I liked it. I found the translation pretty clunky and hard to read. Maybe that was a problem. I get the feeling this was translated in a rush to get it published. So some of the turns of phrase don't ring that well in English. But yeah, let me know what you thought. I thought it was fine. I liked it, but I didn't love it. I read The Starless TV by Erin Morgenstern. I really liked it. I know it's divided a lot of people, but I haven't read the other one, the circus one, so I didn't really know what to expect. I just thought it sounded really cool because it was about, you know, the blurb talked about how it was about a guy who disappeared into an underground book labyrinth and there were magical things. And essentially that's what it is. It's a book lover's dream. It's just seems, it's about an underground magical labyrinth filled with books. Mysterious shenanigans go on. It's very complicated. There are about 10,000 different storylines and characters and lots of different timelines, because a lot of the story is to do with being in and out of time. I really enjoyed it. It didn't all make sense. I still have lots of questions about it. There's still things I'm like, I don't understand anything that was going on in that particular scene, but you know what? I enjoyed it. I found it lovely. I love the descriptions. I love the world building. So I didn't mind that the other stuff didn't make sense, but I do understand why it has infuriated a lot of people because it's very slow and meandering, but it's, to me, I liked it. I found it was really fun. So that was 4 stars for me. The next one I read was an audio book, so I didn't read it. I listened to it. And that was Rick Morton's 100 Days of Dirt. Is that what it's called? No, 100 Years of Dirt. And that's an Australian memoir. So Rick Morton is an Australian journalist, and it's essentially the story of how he grew up in poverty and an abusive household, and how that trauma affected the rest of his life. So it's part memoir. I would say it's more an exploration of the way that trauma in various forms, so physical abuse, verbal abuse, abandonment, neglect, poverty as well, affect individuals and society, and so he brings in a lot of social data, a lot of neurological data. He talks about some really interesting stuff about genetic trauma and how it actually affects your genes. It was really, really interesting. Also, he's gay, and so he talked a lot about the trauma of being not able to come out because you're in a family environment that you know will not support you, or just the anticipation of coming out. He talks about all this research about this anticipatory trauma that the queer community tends to experience. It was really interesting. I guess as a memoir, it was great. There was a lot of really heartbreaking stuff in there, but I would say it's sort of like half memoir, but half using his own story to sort of launch off into explorations of how trauma and how it affects people. And what we really, like how we sort of need population-wide policy solutions to help, really, because he does a really good job of explaining how you just cannot lift yourself up by your bootstraps when you have all these factors against you. He is a successful journalist, but he is very clear that he is the exception, not the rule, and that the only reason he's there is because basically he happens to have met people in his life who have supported him and fostered him, and it's not because of like his own doing. So I do recommend it. It was good. It was good. The next one I read was Chintu by Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi. This is a library copy, quite shiny. I liked this a lot. So Jennifer Makumbi it says she's a Ugandan novelist, but I have the feeling she lives in England. She's Ugandan but lives in England, and she's written another one too called Manchester Happened, I think. I liked this novel. I think I like it more upon reflection than I did actually reading it. I mean, I enjoyed reading it, but the pacing was quite slow. So essentially, it's about Chintu, this man from a few hundred years ago, and for various reasons, he gets a curse. He does a few things, and a curse gets set upon the family so that trauma would keep recurring through all the generations. And so it's split into 5 or 6 sections, I think, and each section focuses on a different descendant and how that trauma kind of manifests itself. And it's often to do through siblings or twins and bad things happening to one twin but not the other. Anyway, it's all very interesting. I found it, I learned a lot about Uganda through reading this, which I think was really great. And the first section, which describes how the first Chintu gets the curse, that was really riveting because it was quite in depth. Whereas I feel like because there were all these other sections and they weren't linked, I found I would just be getting into one section of the story about one character and then it would move on. And I was like, oh, I feel like I didn't quite get enough. But at the same time, it's quite a long novel. It's over 400 pages, so it couldn't have been longer in that regard. Some of the characters do link up at the end, and I found that section had a bit more momentum. But overall, I did find thematically this book raised a lot of interesting questions. For me, it was more about, well, not just for me, for the writer and all readers. I think it's more to do with the idea of Uganda. So I think that Chintu is one of the creation myths for Uganda, and basically it's sort of like a creation story. It's sort of about how does the Ugandan people reform their identity in the wake of all this historical trauma that they've undergone, like including colonization. Obviously this book actually doesn't talk directly about colonization, but obviously the more contemporary characters, it has affected their lives. But all sorts of just the general pain and trauma of being a human, and how does Uganda sort of as a collective sort of think about who they are and reform their identity when, you know, it's hard to escape. You know, even historical trauma is hard to escape, like its effects obviously last deep into the future. So I really enjoyed thinking about it that way, and I've thought a lot about it since. So even though reading it sometimes felt quite slow and not that satisfying, I think what I've learned about Uganda and how it's sort of helped me think has been really valuable. And the next one I read was a New Zealand one, actually, called Lonely Asian Woman by Sharon. I actually don't know where she's from. I think she lived in New Zealand for a while and now she lives in Hong Kong. And this was very funny. It's from a very small press called Lawrence and Gibson. So they're a very small independent press, and a girlfriend of mine who's from New Zealand lent it to me. I think she's friends with one of the editors. And yeah, it was funny. It's about a girl, like I'd say a woman in her early 20s living in New Zealand, working through the ennui and boredom and loneliness of being in between university and getting a job and finding it hard to get a job, and your friends sort of moving on and seeming very successful. So it's sort of quite upper middle class in that way. But yeah, I resonated with a lot of it. It's very funny. It probably could have been more tightly edited. I think there were some bits in it that were quite extraneous, like passages of description that were well written, but I was like, this doesn't add anything. It feels just like descriptions of real places, like real bars or cafes in Wellington in New Zealand, that seemed probably that they were important to the author, but weren't actually that important to the story. But apart from that, it was very enjoyable. It was very short. You could read it in one sitting. Very funny. And it's sort of about this woman trying to find herself, and the main metaphor is through this baby that she steals. So I would say it's very absurdist and surreal as well. And the baby has limbs and features that disappear and reappear. And yeah, anyway, it's funny, it's kind of wild, and I enjoyed it. It was a 3-star read, but I would read more from this author. I think she's, you know, her writing style was I liked it a lot. It was very funny, very relatable. Yeah, so that's, yeah, look out for her. The last one I read was a little middle grade one, The Republic of Birds by Jessica Miller. This is out through text, so she's an Australian writer. She also wrote one called Elizabeth and Zenobia that was shortlisted for the Readings Children's Prize a couple of years ago. This was really good. I really enjoyed it. It's about Olga Oblomov, who is maybe 13 years old, in a land called Stolitsa. And I think this incorporates a lot of Russian folklore. So it's sort of set in a Russian-based fantasy land. So it's very cold, and basically the humans and the birds used to live in peace, and now they don't for various reasons, which get explored in the book. But Olga's dad gets exiled to be kind of the, like, reconnaissance guy for the bird, like the intelligence officer for in the bird republic. So his job is to report back to the human Serena about the birds. So also, because the birds are magical, magic has been outlawed in the human land, but Olga, of course, seems to be demonstrating magical powers and has to keep them a secret. Anyway, she ends up having to go on a journey into the birdland and finds herself. It's definitely not, like, I thought this was going to be much more of an adventure story, and she does kind of go on an adventure, but the point is definitely more her working through her personal ideas of what it means to be herself, sort of not coming of age because she's only 13, but certainly like a miniature coming of age, like a stage of coming of age, of accepting things about herself and who she is, and, you know, how to assert that and be comfortable with that. And part of that includes, you know, how do you treat your family well and yourself well. So yeah, all those messages were really great. It wasn't what I was expecting, but it was still really, really good. Lovely prose style, very easy to read, very clear, very vivid imagery of the snow-covered lands, and lots of little houses on chicken legs once she gets sort of up to the magical bird republic and the forests. So yeah, I recommend it if you're into middle grade sort of fantasy novels. They were all the books that I read during January and February. Hopefully I'll be able to do another, I probably won't be able to do another wrap up till the end of April because I just haven't finished that many books. I keep starting them, not being able to finish them. I'm just in a real slump at the moment. So if you've got any books that you think could help someone out of a reading slump, please let me know below. And also let me know if you've read any of those books and what you think. All right, bye guys.